Edge of Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion, occasionally dealing with mature topics.
Alright everybody, welcome to the Edge of Chaos. I am Joe Ryan, here with Neurotoxin.
Hello.
And today, for the first time ever, we want to welcome a very special guest with us, Maggie McNeill, author of the blog The Honest Courtesan. And I think I'm saying that word correctly. I'm probably screwing it up. But she's here with us to talk about her book, talk about her blog, and basically talk about herself. And I just wanted to say welcome, Maggie.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you guys for having me in the show.
All right. This is interesting because I'll be honest, this is a topic that I had been aware of in the kind of mainstream media portrayal of it, like realizing it's not based in reality, but not really doing the research. In preparing for this interview, I kind of was reading through your site, and it's very interesting, actually, that topic, and I think that you do a great job explaining it, but I just wanted for the benefit of our listeners and everyone else, just, I guess, is there kind of a central thesis you try to impart on your site, or a central idea, or with your book, which is fictional, right? Fictional,
yeah, the book is fiction, but both the book and the blog have the same central motif, if you will. I guess if I had a main mission statement, it would be that a lot of the myths around sex workers revolve around the idea that we're special, that we're somehow different from everybody else, that we're a special subclass. And sometimes it's that we're scarlet women, that we're fallen, that we're Jezebels, etc. Right. Sometimes it's that we're criminals.
Right.
And the common one now, of course, is that we're all victims.
Sex trafficked victims, right. And you talk about that a lot that. Also, yes. Right.
But what I'm trying to do with the blog and with the book is to show that the opposite is true. Mm-hmm. That there's not really a specific hooker type. That there is no one kind of person who does sex work that can be easily distinguished from all the other kinds of people.
Right.
There are smart sex workers and dumb sex workers. They're educated and not educated. They're outgoing and shy.
So wait, they're people just like everyone else's people?
Exactly.
With different traits?
Exactly.
Wow, so you can't just put them in a little box like media likes to do?
No, you can't just make up a test. There's no little hooker test that you can say, ooh, look at that. They're all like that. No, we're not.
Thankfully, because they'd be giving it to girls in 8th grade. Education system.
All right, you're going to re-education. Yeah, exactly.
You have a 30% risk of becoming a prostitute.
Yeah.
So you put you in a special education class about prostitution, about how all prostitutes are victims and they're trafficked. You can just see that, right?
I did wonder, my natural skepticism kind of came out anytime I saw these crazy high figures. Every time I would read about them, many thousand people sex trafficked.
Millions.
I'm like, really?
Oh, yes.
How do they know that? I always wondered, how do they know that? And, the more you grow old, if you're aware of things in the way they are in this country, you question media more and more and more. So I would say it's something I already kind of questioned, but I never delved into the research. So it was very interesting to read about some of the things. And I think you talk about it really intelligently on your site. So it makes it easier to understand for the uninitiated.
Thank you very much.
So I was interested in that, but I believe you had a question.
Well, my kind of follow-up question on that is, I actually have a good friend of mine who is a human trafficking survivor, a legitimate one that was kind of kidnapped by a Romeo pimp when she was about 17. Her parents weren't really paying attention to what she was doing, and she got away about 8 or 9 months later, and she had to do all kinds of things, and she was never, she never had much of a choice in the matter. So her story is very sad and very depressing. But now she does this, I believe she actually listens to our show. She does a lot of kind of awareness work, and she actually trains professionals, law enforcement, politicians, whatever, on human trafficking and sex trafficking. And I've had this conversation with her multiple times, and she is firmly of the belief that at least the grand majority, 90% plus of the prostitutes in the world, sex workers in the world, are against their own will, that they're trafficked, that they're victims, that they are somehow, this is against their will. Now, I'm sure there is some proportion that that's true about.
Certainly.
I just kind of wanted to get your rebuttal on that. I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have with her, obviously, because it's very personal to her. She doesn't have the data and the statistics necessarily behind it. She has her personal experience, but it's not easy to have a conversation with someone that's a survivor of something like that. Obviously, they're going to have their biases, and God bless her for her work, because a lot of the work she does is rescuing legitimately trafficked and also underaged sex workers. But I want to get your idea on that. On your rebuttal on is that I think the figure she cited was about 98% are involuntary.
As a matter of fact, it's funny you mention that figure, because the best data we have is that it's exactly the opposite, that it's 98% voluntary. My own calculations from figures in the United States, there are some Cambodian studies, there are some Indian studies that all come in at roughly right around 2% coerced. And it's funny, that's a very telling figure, because 2% also happens to be roughly the fraction of the female population that are in abusive relationships. So it's very, very telling, because what that tells us is that so-called pimping, so-called sex trafficking, is not really a separate phenomenon from domestic violence. That what we're looking at is that percentage, roughly about 2% of women, for one reason or another, and I'm sure there's complex sociological reasons, but that fraction of women fall into relationships with abusive men. The difference is that for some reason, when the man coerces her into sex work, we pretend it's a different phenomenon than if he coerced her to work at, I don't know, Walmart and took her money. We pretend it's different, and it's not different. It's not different.
Is that any less a pimp? Yeah, you would argue, maybe. Yeah.
But we pretend it is. Somehow it goes back to this whole cultural belief that sex is magically different, from every other human activity. When somebody's coercive, when someone's abducted, when someone's forced to have sex against their will, there are already laws against these things. Right. But people want to make different laws, to coercion when sex is involved, or when it's a sexual issue, coerced sex, they want to make it different when money is involved. They want to pretend that the intersection of the two somehow changes the whole game, changes the rules of the game, and it doesn't. And there's another thing too, neurotoxin, in that the solutions that a lot of these activists propose are not solutions at all. They're, if anything, the opposite. A lot of the things that they propose would, if anything, increase exploitation. We know from history, every time anything's been prohibited, a black market is created. This is the norm. This is all the time. It happened with alcohol, it happened with marijuana, it happened with every drug. It's happened behind the Iron Curtain with books. When you prohibit something, people are still going to want it. And a black market is going to develop. But what the anti-trafficking people want us to believe is that sex, once again, is magically different from everything else, and that somehow with sex, it's the one single thing in the entire human world that if you prohibit it, it goes away. And if you don't prohibit it, it increases.
It does seem to me like the policy comes just like, let's say, and it's a different subject but kind of similar, the moral outrage around homosexuality and the misinformation.
Yes.
When you get to the root of it, where it comes from, it's like, well, how could someone believe something so stupid? Well, it's because their moral outrage over trumps their logic, their reasons, and it comes from I always say on the show, an icky factor.
Yes.
An ickiness factor. It makes them feel just about it inside in their own moral kind of center. It's so disagreeable to their own values that they just have to crusade against it and stamp it out. And it just, when you don't have to scratch the level of the surface to find it. It's not based on any kind of reason or logic or efficacy or anything. It's just based on an outrage.
You mean gay conversion therapy doesn't have a lot of evidence based
I'm almost so curious why they don't have like sex worker conversion therapy.
They do. They do.
Oh, wow.
Let's hear about this, Maggie.
Wow, I found something interesting I didn't know again. Interesting.
Yes.
All right.
They call them diversion programs or rescue programs or rehabilitation programs. they've got them all over the place.
That was more similar to that than I thought. Then
yes,
wow,
no, yes,
that's a good example.
No, they're in Arizona right now.
Arizona, that figures.
Oh yes, and Phoenix.
Show me your paper
Somehow
state.
more outrage in Arizona. That just makes sense.
Just show me your paper state.
And I'm someone who lived in Phoenix for 5 years growing up.
This is in Joe Arpaio land.
Oh man, yeah, that's a whole different show.
No, but I want to hear what Maggie has to say.
Well, he's involved in this. What it is this thing called Project Rose.
Project Rose. Wow.
And it's an acronym, but I can't remember what it stands for.
I've heard
offhand.
about this. Go ahead. Please.
What they do is they have the cops go out twice a year and round up everyone they think looks like a sex worker, and they give them a free ride in a police car with free handcuffs, but it's not an arrest. We're told it's not an arrest because they don't let the people that they give this free ride to speak to an attorney. Because if they arrested them, of course, they would have to let them speak to an attorney. But since it's not an arrest, they don't have to let them speak to an attorney.
Because they have things called rights when they're under arrest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do they do with them?
They take them to a church. The cops take them to Bethany Bible Church.
Oh my!
Which is a kind of a I think it's Baptist. I'm not sure, but there's also Catholic Charities involved. So it's kind of a two faith thing. And they have social workers from Arizona State, and they have prosecutors. So they're basically faced with these unethical social workers, and cops and prosecutors and church people, and basically they're told, we will throw the book at you and hit you with all these charges unless you do this conversion therapy, basically.
I think I lost count on the amount of constitutional rights we just violated
It's
already.
enormous.
Wow.
It's enormous.
How many amendments did we just break?
It's not an arrest, so it's like, am I free to go?
Yeah, but
okay. See ya.
But right,
Unless you want a good time for,
of course, because they're still in handcuffs and they're still guarded by cops.
Dumbest thing I ever heard.
Oh yeah!
Wow.
Well, it's bad enough. It's so bad that there's a petition right now going around among social workers to petition the American. I can't think what the name of the body is.
APA, I would think. American Psychology Association.
No, it's the social work body specifically.
NASW, National Association.
That's the one.
of Social
That's the
Workers,
one.
yes.
They're
Okay.
petitioning them to.
I'm not a member. I don't get involved with those groups.
Yeah, they're petitioning them to basically reprimand the Arizona State School of Social Work, and a group also went to Geneva to complain to the Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Council about it. So it's definitely a big thing, but that's the Arizona one is particularly egregious. But it's not the only one. There's one in New York.
With police and churches cooperating. It's like,
Yeah,
wow.
where is that kind of-
Far off the rails or you have to be. And, yeah.
No, but there's one in Texas. There's one in New York. There's one in Florida. And it's all the same things. Basically, we're rescuing, I'm putting quote marks around that,
Right.
these poor victims, and we're forcing them into this program. So it's very much like the gay conversion.
I actually kind of want to hear about what this therapy entails. Okay, we understand how they round them up and they kind of force them into it. What does the actual therapy entail, though, or the procedure?
We don't know a lot of things about the inside of them. There are a few cases. Basically, a lot of it is just shaming. A lot of it is Bible based. A lot of it is blaming them for their own problems. And a lot of it is teaching them to blame other people. And I know those two things seem at cross purposes, but there you are.
No, that actually makes perfect sense.
And this is where a lot of the pimp stories come from. Because a lot of the time in these programs, since they're taught to seek somebody else, a boyfriend, anybody, their first client, becomes the pimp, becomes the one who made them do it, who coerced them to do it. And we know from stories of underage sex workers that were on the street that the majority of their clients that they do not view as coercive, but they're taught in these programs to reframe that, to view them as coercive people, to see things in a different light, to see things as coercive that maybe at the time they did not find coercive. And so you get a stereotypic confirmation after a time. The things that don't conform to the narrative are discarded, and the things that do conform to the narrative are embellished. And so when they come out the other end of these programs, when they went in, their story might have had some of the elements of the story, of the traditional narrative. When they come out, it's right on the line.
See, and as a social worker, as someone who's trained in therapy, who's dealt with all sorts of people that have been in the streets and abused in various ways and suffering from mental illness and homelessness, not just sex workers, just anybody you can possibly think of who's worked with them, I can understand what you're saying, and I think people underestimate just the power of brainwashing, especially when we're talking about adolescence. If you have something like this, what you're describing to me, and of course you're not a therapy professional, but
No.
I'm hearing this and I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I can totally see how we're not talking about an average sex worker here. We're talking about, like you said, someone that's an adolescent, 14, 15 years old, say they're a runaway. A lot of these runaways are not runaways from home, by the way. They're runaways from institutions, group homes, because they've already, for whatever reason, lost their connection with their family. So you can imagine they already have very troubled lives. They already have difficulty framing things in a developmental sense. They're already kind of confused as to who they are and what's moral and what's not. So if you think about, you put someone like that in a place where everything is suddenly consistent. You talk about being institutionalized. So this is just old-fashioned brainwashing. It's an old-fashioned concentration camp. You're wrong. This is right. And we all think that, that could never happen to me. They put me in there, and I'd resist, and I would be the guy fighting with them, and I'd plan an escape. It does not work that way. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, just as a social worker, as a human behavior professional, that probably 90% of the average population could not resist the way they think they could resist. And then you add the fact that these girls are 14, 15 years old, and they don't have very good role models. They don't have a lot of consistency in their lives. So I can totally see where you're just taking sex workers who are underage, and they do need help. I don't believe in underage girls being on the streets working as prostitutes, and there's nothing to do with freedom to do sex work. It's just, they're adolescents, obviously. And you put them in a place like that. You're just basically building an army of future anti-trafficking activists.
And that's
what this is.
Yeah, that's what they want to do.
Right.
And I just want to mention something, not to correct at all, but just the average underage sex worker enters the trade at 16.
Underaged. Okay.
Yeah, at 16. The
Underage
average underaged girl. Okay. Even the average underage girls, what I'm saying is that even the average underage worker is not all that underage. She's just, the average one that they pick up is probably 17.
Did not
a lot
know
of
that.
times it's just a few months away from being legal. And sometimes it's very funny because I've read narratives from street people, and I say girls because of my own. The majority of adult sex workers are female, but a big study in New York a few years ago showed that on underage workers, roughly half are boys. So there's a much larger fraction in the underage group that are boys. So I try to say people, when I can.
Well, you're coming from your perspective, yeah.
I come from my own perspective, right? But
your own history and all that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I did not.
I've
know
read that.
either.
I have read that. Especially in big cities, I hear that.
Yeah, in big cities.
Happens in big cities a lot.
But the thing is, so what happens is with some of these that they can, if they're underage, and I mean if they're 17 years, 11 months, 20-something days, they're treated as victims. And a few days later, if they've hit 18, suddenly they're just criminals.
They're criminals, right? Yeah. Very arbitrary lines, once
very
again.
arbitrary,
We just draw,
It's just like that magic, one of my readers long ago, and I use this metaphor all the time because it's a wonderful metaphor, is remember the comic book character Captain Marvel, and he was Billy Batson, he was a little boy. But as soon as he said Shazam, he instantly transformed into an adult man.
Right.
And that's what it seems like our law likes to pretend, that there's someone who's essentially equivalent to a 4-year-old.
Right.
And then at midnight on their 18th birthday, they shout Shazam, and they might as well
adults,
be a 40-year-old.
Right. With all the experience and
Everything.
morals there, too. Yeah.
Everything.
And not to mention the fact that when you're talking about an international thing, where that law is drawn is very different when you're talking about sometimes in Europe, which they're making that the same in Europe now with the EU.
Yes, everybody's making it the same. The UN
That's
a few
another
years
thing,
ago.
yeah. But up till, let's say, 20 years ago, those were different lines. Like, you might go to Europe and it's 16. You might go to somewhere else at 17. You might go to Vietnam, it's 15 or 14.
It depends where you are in Europe.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. But that's the thing. I've actually read about that with the EU, they're trying to make everything 18
Well,
across the
and
board.
it's and the UN because Laura Augustin, who's the anthropologist, she's talked about this, where she's pointed out that the UN has imposed 18 as being the age of adulthood, even in on traditional African cultures,
Right.
where people are generally considered to be adults as soon as they can assume adult responsibilities, which might be 15, might be 16, and yet now they're telling these people who often live in rural settings, no, these people are children.
Right.
And you know if they work they do a full adult day's work, that this is abuse.
They're reversing, how many thousands of years of cultural tradition now,
Exactly.
right,
But
from on high.
Very imperialistic.
But we can see how this is the same thing going on as what we described in Arizona. It's just our standards, our morals, you're wrong, we're right,
Yes.
you're going to reframe this. And it's just, I think this is a good time to come in with just standardization in general. I mean, obviously, there's benefits to, okay, if the entire world, or at least like a body like the EU, if we all have the same standard, okay, standard of adulthood is 18, not 17, not 16, and those numbers are not any better than 18. It's just, this is what one country says, a different country. They're a little better because of those countries are a little more homogeneous, at least they have a little more consensus on where that line falls, but it's just as ridiculous. And we had this running joke when we were a lot younger that, like, when one of our friends would turn 18, like, okay, so, John, when you turned 18, did you feel that just sudden smack of responsibility? I'm an adult now.
Of course.
Are you different now? Yeah, do you feel it? Yeah.
Of course.
It's the dumbest thing in the world. And actually, this is a good thing, I think, to bring up on the show. Is I've always had an issue with age, like legal age for anything. And that includes age of consent. But, and I mean laws. Whether it's like drinking age, smoking age of consent, gambling, anything you can think of. I mean, I understand that there's a need to protect children from certain things and that children shouldn't be running around drinking. I mean, I grew up in the USSR, so I definitely understand why that's a problem. What I think, as a radical libertarian, is that if a child at 9 or 10 years old is getting access to alcohol, the law is not going to help that child.
No,
if the parents are not paying attention,
the judge is standing there locking the liquor cabinet. I mean, what are you going to do? Yeah. Oh, so wait a minute. So you're saying that the drinking age being at 21 means that no 18 and 19-year-old frat boy idiots are getting drunk and killing themselves?
Oh, I have never
surely
seen
that
such
never happens, right? Or even surely that taboo effect doesn't contribute maybe to them drinking more than they would if they were just allowed to.
Right,
because legally,
does.
Right.
But,
they don't work.
Right,
they don't
but
work.
the issue with this is if we move further from that. So first you have these standardized morals of, okay, it's okay to do at this age. It's okay to do frame this way but not that way. This is moral, this isn't. This doesn't work, as I think we all three agree this doesn't work, because people are not machines. People are different. Some people it's going to work on, some people it's not. It really depends on their personal experiences, their development, where they are. Some people are just going to think it's okay. They're just not going to accept this. There's a myriad of reasons for why it doesn't work. Like you said, the black market is one kind of effect of this. But I think another problem that a lot of libertarians I've read bring up, Larry Elder, for example, is that when you create unenforceable laws, you kind of create the mindset in people that following the law is optional. It's voluntary. It's like, look, drinking's illegal and underage, and everyone's drinking. Drugs are illegal, and they're on every corner. It's like, but laws, who cares? And then you have actually, it's more. I think that's more of the standardization is, and kind of the moralizing is more of a liberal mentality. And then the conservatives come in with their, okay, we have to enforce this, so we need preemptive laws. We need laws that keep people from breaking other laws, and that's where you get into the things you talked about earlier in the show, where it's okay, because we have a problem with sex trafficking, we have a problem, let's say, with underage sex workers, just to use that term, even if they're, almost 18. We're going to crack down on prostitution in general.
Correct.
Because we have to save these, supposed underage sex workers. And she wrote an editorial about this for Tony Stiles a few months back on just sex taboo, and we'll get into that shortly. But kind of one of the issues that I've discussed at length and on the show also is that propaganda tends to kind of replace just empirical research.
Oh, absolutely.
So, just like with drugs, okay, you had the war on drugs,
Yeah.
70s, early 80s, and it's just 99% of what you learn in DARE. It's just plain bullshit. I know this because I have my psychology degree, I have a social work degree. I've studied this stuff. The real effects of drugs, how likely you are to become addicted if you take drugs, the whole idea of marijuana being a gateway drug. It's all complete
It's false.
garbage.
Flat false.
Yeah.
It's not even remotely true.
It's not necessarily
Yeah,
a flat-out lie, but it's just, statistics are very easy to manipulate when people don't understand how to look at empirical inquiry. So I feel like what I'm hearing from you, Maggie, is the same thing happens in the prostitution world and the sex worker world. Is that you take a statistic, and you say, for example, if an underage sex worker, let's say underage as being under 18, is 6 times more likely to get raped than an adult sex worker. Well, that statistic may be true, but until you have the context, until you know the likelihood for both, it's completely useless.
Yes.
And this is the problem: is government uses the lack of research and the lack of actual reliable numbers to just spin the ones that you do have whichever way they want, and then they have the money to turn this into an ad campaign and to become basically a moral arbiter. Look, this is wrong. It's like, no, okay, where's the source? Where's the money for this coming from?
Yeah,
So I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, there's an even more extreme version, I guess, is what I would say, of what you were just saying, where they actually manufacture false statistics that they know to be false. And what I mean by this is the study I mentioned recently about the boys, finding that in New York City, finding that the boys were almost as many as the girls. That study was commissioned around 2007, I believe, by the DOJ. And the problem was, it was a good study. And when I say that's a problem, because the government didn't really want a good study. The government wanted a study that would support what its propaganda was. This study did not support that propaganda. For example, the government wants to claim that the majority of underage sex workers are forced. This study, the John Jay study, found that only 10% reported coercion as a factor getting in. That's of underage workers. Okay, so as a matter of fact, 84% of them reported never even having as much as met a pimp. So, but yet the mythology is that they all have one. And so you have this, and it blew a lot of other things out of the water. This is just one example. The age was another one. The average age of debut for underage sex workers, I believe, that John Jay found was 15.9. So again, closest damn it to 16. And the problem was the government didn't like this study. And so even though it was very expensive, and even though it took years, and even though it was methodologically sound, you will not find it listed on the DOJ website. You will not find it referred to by any government bureau. Instead, what they did is they turned around, they hired the assistant to the guy that headed the John Jay study, and she was younger and less experienced, and I'm sure they waved a lot of money at her, and they got her to do a study, to design a study that would prove what they wanted proven. Well, the best, easiest way to do this was to go to prisons.
Oh, no.
And interview a bunch of men that had been convicted of pimping and ask them how important pimps were. Wow. And of course, all of them said, oh, pimps run the whole show. Pimps are everything. Pimps make all this money. Pimps do this and pimps do that.
Okay, I got one word for you, DOJ. It's called representativeness.
You know what that sounds like? With George, it's a different subject, but George Carlin was talking about, the sanctity of life. He's like, well, who do you hear that from? People who are alive. Like, what does John F. Kennedy or Gandhi, what do they have to say about the sanctity of life? Nothing, because they're fucking dead, and it's made up, and we're self-interested, and that, and actually, so what he was saying, what you were saying, I wanted to ask you to kind of elaborate on, for our listeners' benefit, is something you mentioned in your site a lot, called the Swedish model.
Yes.
And also the Nordic model, I guess, is a difference. Just
the same thing. Yeah, right? The same thing.
And that, if I understand it correctly, at least just reading what you wrote about it, it's going after this idea of prostitution as a thing by basically slamming the demand side. Is that kind of what they're trying to do?
What it is that the Swedish model, or the Nordic model if you prefer, I prefer to call it the Swedish model because it originated in Sweden. What it is it's the belief, is based on the belief that women are incapable of thinking and acting pragmatically where sex is involved. That women are literally completely unable to say, I will make this pragmatic transaction. A man will give me X dollars, or or kroner in Sweden. They will give me X amount of money, and I will provide this service for him. That if a woman does this, that there must be some factor of coercion, or there must be something wrong with her. She must be mentally ill, she must be coerced, or whatever. And if you've only got two parties in the transaction, the client and the worker, and the worker is not responsible, who's doing the coercing? Obviously, it has to be the client.
So it starts with the presupposition.
It starts with the presupposition that women are basically incompetent.
Right.
Well, as far as sex is concerned, I mean, I can't say say what else.
What's wrong with the law that starts with that as an idea? Hey, what's wrong with that?
Well, the comparison I've made is that what it basically does is the only other laws I can see that closely resemble the Swedish model in that kind of one-sided criminalization is statutory rape laws. Mm-hmm. In the sense that when I was 15 and 16, I was sexually active. Mm-hmm. I was sexually active with a lot of men over 18 because I looked much older than I actually was. I was the one that always got sent in to buy cigarettes and liquor because I never got caught.
Yeah,
I never got caught.
It happens.
And so guys had no idea. I also started university very young. I was 16 when I started. And so, of course, guys just assumed I was 18.
They would think, yeah, exactly.
So I was a freshman, so
who
be
in that situation, in their situation, checks an ID?
Well, nobody does.
Right, are you supposed to cart them in bed?
Yeah, nobody does.
Right, everyone's a bouncer now in their own bed. It's like, seriously?
But here's the thing. If we had been caught somehow, okay?
He goes to jail.
He goes to jail, right. I don't go to jail. So my consent is invalidated.
Correct.
Because of my age. In Sweden, a woman's consent is invalidated merely because of her sex.
Wow. All right.
And this is even true to the point where about 2 years ago, there was a big sting that they did. And, a whole bunch of men, I don't remember how many it was, 20-something men, were convicted of violating this law. One of them was 17. So what and remember, in the EU, and that includes Sweden, 18 is the age.
Right.
And so what we're being told is that a male minor is more morally culpable than an adult female, where sex work is concerned.
So they're all screwed up just in a different way.
But we're being told this is feminist.
The inferiors are just merely females.
But we're being told this is feminist, right?
A number of age. Wow.
And a lot of the propaganda involving the Swedish model claims that the women are decriminalized. I suppose in the strictest legal sense that would be true, in the sense that no criminal charges can be preferred against them for the sale of sex. However, as we know very well from the United States, there are plenty of extrajudicial penalties. There are plenty of ways to hurt people. We're told in the United States the sex offender registry is not a criminal penalty.
Oh, that's charming.
We're told that,
right.
though.
Yeah.
We're told that, right? There have been several court cases where they ruled, no, this is pure administrative, and yet it's obviously a penalty.
People who urinate in public are on it now, for example, and that's not even a felony.
Yeah, exactly. Mugshots.
They end up homeless because they can't find a place to live that's not within so many feet of a school.
Then you get sex offender laws where there's geographic restriction, which California is one of those states,
Correct.
as is Florida, as is a bunch of others.
And mugshots. Mugshot, releasing people's mugshots. Certainly that's extrajudicial.
And again, it goes back to what Joe said. If it were a judicial thing, they'd have rights.
Correct.
And they could
You
fight
have rights,
this
yeah.
Correct. No, it's just a registry.
No, correct.
We're just going to put your face on a board and say this guy's a creep, don't hire him, don't rent to him. But no,
it's
you're
not
a criminal.
No, right.
And that's exactly what we've got in Sweden with the Swedish model, in the sense that, yes, they're not criminalized judicially, but They are. There was a case a couple of years ago where a girl who was talking about being a stripper and being an escort to her classmates was kicked out of the university because she was promoting something that the state disapproves of. So it was an extrajudicial punishment. She was denied her education.
That happens a lot. I think there was just a Duke student who got kicked out because
she didn't get kicked out.
No, she didn't.
No, she
I think
did
you know what I'm talking about, right? She got pictures taken or something like that? Yeah.
Yes, Belle Knox. And in fact, she's doing a guest column for my blog next month for July.
You should look at that.
Yep. Great. I mean,
she
I wish
I
I
stink and didn't get kicked out, didn't she? She actually got public opinion on her side. Maybe.
Well, I don't think Duke even tried to kick her out. I mean, she can correct me if that's wrong, but I don't believe that there was any talk of that. It was just that people tried to shame her out.
That's right. Okay, right.
Yeah,
okay.
It's
I see.
Definitely not only extrajudicial, but not official either. But the thing in Sweden I wanted to continue was that in Sweden, what they actually can do is things like there's still pimping laws, of course.
Uh-huh.
So what they do is they go to the landlord and they say, do you realize that you could be convicted of operating a brothel?
That's how they deal with marijuana dispensaries here.
Correct.
The feds do that for states that it's legal to have a dispensary.
Correct. So
it does sometimes. It does toss them out on the street.
We'll get into that.
But
Let's just let Maggie finish with that.
In Norway, which also has the Swedish model, which is why it's something called the Nordic model, they actually had something the police named. You know how the police love to name their little schemes. They called it Operation Homeless. And what they did is they went around finding the addresses of all these sex workers and reporting them to their landlords so they would get evicted.
Charming.
But that's not criminal. That's not criminalization.
No, you're just homeless, that's all.
And then they spy on them, of course, so that they can catch the clients. So there's that, and that's, wiretapping, tapping their phones, all that sort of thing. And then there have even been a few cases of where the court decided, or the police decided, whichever one, that there needed to be evidence collected from the, quote, crime scene, close quote. Well, when it's a criminal sex act, where is the crime scene? The crime scene is a woman's vagina. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to collect evidence from the crime scene, meaning medical intrusion against her will.
So which is rape, right? Which is wow.
But it's not criminal.
No.
It's not criminal.
You're just being forced to have a medical procedure done on yourself, right?
And of course, Canada, the Canadian government, back in for listeners who may not be familiar, back in December, the Canadian Supreme Court overturned all the laws in Canada pertaining to sex work. Basically, sex work itself has never been criminal. Prostitution, the actual sale of sex, has never been illegal in Canada. There were some laws around it, which is pretty typical in the British Empire. So-called anti-pimping laws, so-called anti-brothel laws, and so-called anti-soliciting laws. Those were all overturned because the court recognized correctly that they make life a lot more dangerous for sex workers. Well, the court stayed its decision for a year to give the Canadian government time to come up with something new. And what the government came up with, and just released this past week, is basically the Swedish model on steroids, it's being called. Wonderful. It's the Swedish model plus extra things, like criminalization of advertising, like outlawing porn, weirdly enough.
Okay.
A couple of other things, just really strange. But it will never stand a constitutional challenge. And so my opinion, of course, is that the government is just basically trying to figure out a way to stall so that they can pass the hot potato to the next government. And
That's
history will record
of most governments.
Yeah, history will record decrim is happening under the liberals, let's say,
right,
instead of the conservatives.
Now, my comment on that, on a lot of what you said. First of all, you're saying Swedish model, and I believe that's what it's called, but it kind of goes back to Roman paganism and kind of Greek paganism. This idea that, like, in ancient Greece and in parts of ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, the punishment for raping a woman was actually less than the punishment for committing adultery with a married woman. And the thinking behind this was, if you rape her, yes, that's a crime, it is wrong, but she didn't consent. So you did something against her consent, so women are treated as property, essentially as livestock. So it's like Joe breaking into my house and taking something. Whereas if it was consensual adultery, then you corrupted her mind. Because no, she couldn't possibly have wanted it with you.
Right.
Because women
Right.
don't have that
Right.
capacity.
No,
Who
no.
came up with that?
Right.
You know? And it's sick. We're still in that mindset. We like to think that we've come so far. And like you said, the people advocating this think they're feminists.
Yes.
They think, oh, we're advocating for women's rights not to make their own decisions.
Right.
And that kind of brings me into the next thought on this is, and we've said this on the show multiple times, whatever the government is doing to the others today, it's going to do to you tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely.
We've said this about terrorists. We've said this about
drug criminals. Yeah,
right, and whatever. Right. And when you talk about this being extrajudicial, not falling within the framework of law enforcement, because then they would have rights. It's just the Constitution is very good at slowly. It doesn't always work very fast, but it slowly knocks all this stuff out. The government comes up with it 4 or 5 years later. Someone's smart enough to challenge, like, nope, that's crap. Get rid of it. So more and more, I've been seeing this disturbing pattern, and there's a relation to 9/11, but I don't think it's just that. It's just the government trying to find ways around the Constitution, because they've already realized you cannot take the Constitution head on. It will win every time. It's a little delayed. You might be able to do some damage, but eventually they'll come and they'll flush you out. So we're getting to this point where just everything the government wants to do is essentially civil, because criminal penalties, nope, you'll get smacked over the head with the Constitution. And it's sick in that a lot of what they're trying to do in going around the Constitution, honestly, what scares me more is than just the kind of civil, non-criminal law enforcement, is the cultural aspect, the brainwashing aspect. So obviously the Swedish model is
I
a
wanted
huge
to mention that
piece of it. But also, just like we said, we had DARE with drugs. This is actually, I would think, older than that. Before the 1970s, drugs were not viewed the same taboo way that we view them now. This is really, it's been a government propaganda-driven thing. And I don't think it ever completely caught on. But in public culture, you can't speak out, oh yeah, I'm pro-drug at work, because you don't know if that one person, you don't know how your boss feels about it.
Right.
So the same thing with sex work. I think there's always been that stigma. It hasn't really...
It's not new.
No.
And right, my take on this, and again, my take on all prohibition is this same way, is it doesn't work, again, we've talked about this already today, because the laws are not enforceable. And I can't think of a more unenforceable law than anything that restricts sex acts, sex work, just being one type. People are gonna fuck.
Right.
You don't need anything.
Stop that. Right.
You don't need anything. You really, all you need is two people's bodies and their consent, right? And what you're able to do without the help of anything, you're able to sell. At least with drugs, you need the paraphernalia, you need the actual drugs. With things like gambling, you need a place to do it, you need multiple people most of the time. You may or may not need, like, chips. You can make chips out of paper, but at least there's other things involved. With prostitution, the idea that...
Short of government-issued chastity belts, what are you going to do?
Even that's not going to work, Joe.
You'll pick the lock, and then there you go.
I mean, okay, look, how are those border walls working out for us?
Oh, I know,
talk about government-issued chastity belts, right? It's really... See, a lot of people want to frame this in a moral way. I'm trying to frame it, just being dry social scientist, I'm going to frame it in a practicality way. How do you expect this to succeed? We're talking about making people homeless. We're talking about promoting stigma in schools, in religion, in public institutions. We're talking about doing everything we can to basically just make it look like this is being stopped. How's that working out? And I guess that would be my next question.
Well, it's interesting that there's a couple of issues you raised there. One is that through most of human history, even though it's true that prostitution has pretty much always had some kind of stigma in pretty much every culture, it's varied from culture to culture as to how much stigma and to the form of the stigma. But prior to the 19th century, prostitution being defined, or harlotry, to use the old term, being defined as being the taking of money for sex, that's new. That's 19th century. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that there was not any such thing as a prostitute before. Of course there was. What I mean is that there was no moral line drawn between a woman who took money for sex or a woman who just gave it away. There was no distinction.
Did not know that.
Yes, the distinction was doing it outside of marriage. That was the distinction.
Okay.
So you'll see in old terminology when some old manuscript, medieval or whatever, refers to a harlot, they don't necessarily mean a woman who takes money for
a woman of loose morals. They
Correct.
would say, yeah,
a woman of loose morals, a house of ill repute. We used to say, right?
Right. Yeah.
Same basic notion. It wouldn't matter in those days, pre-19th century. A woman could be, if there was a law against harlotry of some sort, she could be just as much arrested for giving away or for living with a man outside of marriage, all right, as she could for taking money for it. In fact, there were actually some theologians in the early Middle Ages who argued that commercial prostitution was less immoral than just giving it away.
Isn't that kind of related to what we're talking about, Roman paganism? With
Yes.
Right?
Yes, very similar. And of course, the Romans loved their whores. Actually, they had a lot of money wrapped up in it, and they had a lot of restrictions. But they still, in general, as ancient cultures go, the Romans were actually pretty pro whore. However, in the 19th century, this idea arose that it was the money that was the uniquely contaminating factor. And so basically what they did in creating the prostitute, in defining the prostitute as a thing into existence, is they narrowed the legal focus. They gave even working class women somebody they could look down on, right? Because then a working class woman could say, well, at least I don't take money for it. But what they also did was they created a nightmare of enforcement. Because before, if you wanted to enforce your moral laws, you catch two people together, all you had to do is say, are you married? If they couldn't produce the paper, boom, they're in. That's it. But now, what do you do? How do you prove it? How do you prove now? They created this nightmare because what they've done is they've created a situation where it's a crime that is determined entirely by motive. There's nothing else to the so-called crime of prostitution except motive. If I give sex away, if I have sex with a man because I'm grateful to him, if I have sex with a man because I want to pass the time, because I want to, even because I think I might better blackmail him later as long as I don't actually blackmail him. Any of these things, they're perfectly legal. It's completely legal. Private detectives even do these honey traps, right? And they're legal, where they use a beautiful woman to trick a man into having sex so they can catch him in a compromising position. Legal. Gray, but legal. But if there's money involved, boom, suddenly it's illegal. So what you've done is you've created a very strong perverse incentive for police to lie. Because it's all a he said, she said. It's all, the prostitution cases are 99% the cop going to court and basically saying, she said this, whether she actually said it or not. Because it's all about what's going on in her head. And until we get a mind probe, that can record people's thoughts, there's no way of knowing that. There's no way of knowing.
Well, there's cameras. I mean, one thing that here in San Diego they're introducing with SDPD is actually the cops have uniform cameras. And if they're contacting somebody, whether or not they're detaining them, arresting them, the camera has to be on. So this is actually, I've read about this, there have been some questions raised about this in terms of surveillance, but it actually turns out this works out better because now they have to actually have evidence.
Yes.
They can't just quote the person as saying,
yes.
That's the thing. They can't do their little cop tricks anymore on people. It's recorded now. Yeah.
Well, the one time I was arrested, when I got to see the police report, I was appalled. I was utterly appalled because
it's fiction.
It was complete fiction.
It's made up. It's a novel. Yeah.
Totally. And it was. I've often said it was basically like porn written by a 14-year-old.
Oh, and then she offered herself to me.
Yes.
And then
yes. It was nothing. It was nothing.
Maximum effect.
It was nothing that I would ever say, even in a. Not even if I was asked to, not even if I was paid to, just things that would never come out of my mouth.
You, right? Yeah, you wrote this.
Just awful things, and so, but this is the whole point. And all over the country, and this is the I'm doing a lot of appearances at chapters of Liberty on the Rocks while I'm on this tour, And the main focus of my my speech, if you want to call it that, my talk, is that these laws don't just affect sex workers and clients; they affect everybody, because the cops do things like arresting people for carrying condoms. They arrest.
Oh my!
You
good
can't be
Lord.
serious.
Oh yes, no, yes. This is a very big problem. They arrest people for having
Well, because
condoms.
abstinence only, of course, that's the best. So why would you have a
Public
condom?
health
It's the same thing
nightmare.
they tell teenagers.
Public
yeah.
health nightmare. They do this. They've arrested women for cops checking to see if they had underwear on, and arresting them they had no underwear. For of
Fourth
course,
Amendment issues all over that.
and of
Wow.
course, all the traditional ones: walking down the street, loitering, talking to someone in a car.
We're arresting people for walking down the street now.
Yes.
Ask
Waving,
ask your average black or
winking.
Latino person how well that's been going.
Exactly.
They get arrested for walking down the street all the time.
Exactly.
Go to NYC, it happens every day.
There was a case in New York just a few months
Stop
ago
and frisk
where the
land.
cop said that the woman was that she was wearing revealing clothes. Her revealing clothes were skinny jeans and a coat.
Wow. All right.
Well, New York. I mean, we've already seen.
Well, the
New
judge
York
threw
City.
that out. The judge actually threw that. I laughed at it. Was a female judge, and I laughed at what she said. She said something like, "This reads more like a 1950s high school dress code than like a police report."
Right. That's our one hope, actually, is to get judges that are logical and throw this crap out. But I did want to, aside from the legal stuff, which we could probably talk about that day, I wanted to get your just thoughts on. I guess we were talking about the cultural thing. I guess if we focus on America, isn't it just? I guess, what is your reaction every time you see one of these sex scandals in the news? And I'll give you an example of Elliot Spitzer. Here's a guy who was very respected politician, law and order guy, was the one guy that was going to kick Wall Street's ass, and then he gets caught with a whore. And now he's persona non grata, tossed out on his ear,
Oh yeah, and the
Isn't
thing
this
is,
amazing what we do to people over this issue?
This is that American Puritanism.
Right.
Two quotes for you. One from a famous person and one from a not. The famous person is Marlene Dietrich, and she once said, and this is maybe not exact, but it's very close to this: sex in the rest of the world a fact, in America an obsession.
Because we have a very hypocritical thing about
We
sex.
do.
Sorry,
We
your other
do.
quote.
and the other quote was from someone I was talking to online a few years ago. It was an Australian, and I said, it's funny that the United States and Australia are so alike in so many ways, and yet so different in so many ways. And he goes, "That's because we got all the criminals, and you got all the religious fanatics."
They actually have a very really restrictive attitude about sex too. I think in certain
Australians,
ways. Kind of.
That's
well,
what I've heard.
when it comes to sex work, they've been very much more sensible in general. New South Wales, which is the easternmost state of Australia, where Sydney is, they've decriminalized sex work.
Good.
Basically, they and New Zealand are the only two places in the world that have. And this is an important distinction, and I want your listeners to know about this, because people talk about legalization, and very often the prohibitionists will use the example of the Netherlands or Germany, and they will pretend that this is the only alternative to either full criminalization, United States style, or the Swedish model. And the truth is, no, it is not. Legalization is based in the peculiar belief that sex is a special case. And so therefore, sex has to be treated specially. So you have that in Nevada, for example. Mm-hmm. The idea that women cannot be trusted to do business for themselves. They can only be trusted to do business under the watchful eye of a political crony who has a license, and there's a limited number of those licenses.
Yep.
And she has to do it hundreds of miles away from where civilized people live.
There's this little town where all the brothels are.
Yes,
I've
hidden
read about
away,
it,
way out in the desert. Well, not one town, but they can't do it in big towns.
There was a particular one, I read about.
It's the counties. It's up to the counties, and
It's up to the
larger
counties. Yes.
don't have it. No.
Yeah.
But the peculiarity of these laws is clearly revealed by the fact that they're so arbitrary. In Nevada, the only legal way to sell sex is in a brothel. In Canada, just 2,000 miles away?
Not very far.
It's the opposite. You can't do it in a brothel, but you can do it anywhere else. The same thing over in Europe. In the Netherlands, brothels, legal. England, brothels, not legal. And so you go everywhere in the world and you'll see these crazy differences in the laws. Whereas what happened in New Zealand and New South Wales is they realized that as soon as you start piling these laws on, you create the opportunity for corruption.
Concept.
Example. In the Australian state of Queensland, prostitution is legalized. Okay, in other words, there's rules. Okay, like Nevada, like England, like Canada. The rules in Queensland say that a girl can work on her own, or she can work in a licensed brothel. There are no other alternatives. So, if you have two girls that travel to keep each other company and to share expenses, like they're sharing a hotel room, right?
That's
and one
illegal.
gets out, that's illegal.
Right. They have to be all on their own, all by themselves.
All by themselves.
Right,
and
yeah.
the cops in Queensland will actually do stings to try to catch them working together and arrest them for it.
Oh, man.
So as soon as you create a law, you create an opportunity for corruption. And New South Wales realized, you know what? Police corruption is something we do not want. So we're going to simply, and this is what decriminalization simply is. Decriminalization is saying, why treat prostitution separately from other jobs? Let's just cover it with the same laws that cover other businesses. And so there are still zoning laws, there are still employment laws. If you have a brothel, you still have to have, the Australian equivalent of workers' comp and all that kind of stuff. So all the laws that apply to a restaurant or that apply to a daycare center or whatever, any place that employs a bunch of people that have
Employees,
other people coming in.
Employees, right.
Okay? That's the same kinds of laws. And yeah, there's a few exceptions, and some people will say, oh, well, that's not still pure decrim because they have this one law. Well, yeah, but it's the closest thing we have to pure decrim. In New Zealand, for example, that they prohibit anybody who's not a New Zealand citizen from doing sex work. And the funny thing about it is, the exceptions prove the strength and the usefulness of decrim, because the only problems in New Zealand are found among the workers who are excluded from the decriminalized model. In other words, the only cases of exploitation, are on the visitors. The ones that are specifically excluded. So as soon as you create one group that you're saying you're not protected by the law, that group is the one that gets exploited. Surprise, surprise.
And that's actually another question I wanted to ask. I think it's a good time to ask. It's a little bit of a segue, but
Go ahead.
Legal protection. So one of the huge problems with any black market is that whoever's involved in it, whether they're sex workers, whether they're drug dealers, like kids on the street that are dealing drugs, or illegal gambling establishments, they can no longer count on the protection of the law.
Correct.
At least not in the same way. So when we talk about, when we started earlier in the show, we were talking about how maybe 2% of sex workers are coerced or trafficked. But even if they're not coerced or trafficked into being sex workers, just like any woman can go on a date, not accurately judge a man's character and get date raped, this happens all the time. Especially on college campuses, we hear about this. It's a real thing. The same way a prostitute can enter non-coercively, voluntarily into an agreement where she's going to have sex for money and then be raped or abused or beaten. This happens all the time. And actually, in fact, a lot of prohibitionists use this as, you see, but prostitutes are more
because
likely
of that,
to be
we have to make it all illegal,
and they're more likely to get raped. Well, the only reason, I don't think they're necessarily more likely to get raped or assaulted, they're more likely to not report the rape or assault, because at that point, they're admitting to a crime. You're basically calling the police on yourself.
That's Fifth Amendment, yeah.
And
Correct.
if you look at the conviction rate for rape in this country, or sexual assault, and how much of that goes unpunished or even unreported, because it is a difficult thing to prove, and there's a lot of shaming and guilt involved, and cultural stigma. And then you add the prostitution factor. So I kind of want to hear your thoughts, maybe even your experiences, if you're willing to share those, if you have ones you'd like to share, on that if you want to talk about victimizing prostitutes and sex workers, I would think that's the number one reason they get victimized, is because the police are against them too. So
yes.
you have nowhere to go.
Exactly. The police are, and even in countries where the actual act is not criminal, again, Great Britain and Canada, the police don't care because it's still considered a gray area. It's still considered a problem area. They're still considered problems to be solved, and therefore, of course, the big case was Robert Picton in Canada. He preyed on Vancouver sex workers for years and years. And some of the girls in downtown Eastside, which was the big stroll there, the big red light district, they even went to the police. And they said, we think it's this one particular guy. The police ignored them. Because who cares what a hooker says?
Oh,
okay? And that Picton case actually was one of the driving forces behind the Supreme Court's decision last December. Was because it's such a clear and obvious example of how when you push something into the shadows, it becomes more dangerous. And of course the Swedish model, which is supposedly so wonderful, does nothing to help this, because if the clients won't go in a well-lit area, if the clients are worried about being caught by the cops, then the sex workers have to go where the clients go.
Right.
The sex workers have to help.
That just makes sense. Yeah,
It just puts them in the same position again. But no, we can't report. I report cases in my blog all the time, of women being assaulted, being robbed, being raped, going to the police, and the police's immediate reaction is to arrest them.
Wonderful. I mean, that's
I think that's
how
encouraging
to the women to go to the police, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's funny how woven in the culture that idea is, and how no one questions it. Like, you get things like, if you think about the scene in Godfather 2, where that senator wanted to squeeze Michael Corleone, how did he get him on his side? Well, he was in a brothel and accidentally killed a hooker, and now he's got dirt on him. So of course we're not going to let that get out, but you got to play ball. So it's been used through so much history,
of course,
to get over on people, and
the idea
the hooker themselves is reduced to just chattel in the transaction.
Correct.
Now,
She's
while
just
these
reduced
political
to
things
just a
going
thing.
on.
Yeah,
right.
just a thing.
Right.
Just a thing to be and even in Australia, even with so many states, having loosened the laws in one way or another. It's not all of them. Western Australia is still pretty bad, from what I understand. But there was a case early last year. Jill Mager was her name. She was a newswoman, I believe. I'm not positive of that. But anyway, she was raped and murdered by this horrible person. And it came out in the trial that this person had raped and assaulted, not murdered, but raped and assaulted a number of sex workers before. And he had been caught. But every time he was convicted, he was slapped on the wrist because his victims were sex workers.
Oh, well, they were just...
Because that's okay.
That's not real women. That's
so
just
he got
sex
a
workers.
year, he got 18 months, that sort of thing. And so he kept getting out. And what Mager's husband said in like the sentencing statements and all that, and he said a wonderful thing. He said, I was just very, very impressed with this. He said what the law did by doing this is the message they sent to violent men was not don't rape. It was be careful who you rape.
Well, that's just
don't rape the wrong person. Don't rape an
rape
actual
the wrong
person.
person. Don't rape a real woman.
Right.
Just rape rape a sex worker. Then hey, if you get punished at all, it'll be 6 months. Who cares?
It makes those, like, they have to be all by themselves laws even more malicious.
Even more malicious.
Because especially since we were talking about the whole thing about pimping, it's always a male thing. Males pimping women,
supposedly.
Even though, like, isn't it through history, like, a lot of madams were madams.
Of course.
People who run bordels were other women or other sex workers who sort of were the more senior in the ranks, so to speak.
The pimp as we know him, the idea of the street pimp, the idea of that, that man that acts as an intermediary.
Right.
That is very recent.
That's very new.
Yes, it is. 19th century. And it's not America. It originated in France, actually.
Oh, that's right. Oh, like you posted about James Lipton, right?
Yes.
I think you posted about him, right? He ran one at some point or something.
But what it basically derives from is it derives from these laws, these 19th century laws that attempted to, these social engineering laws that basically started to control, well, we're not going to allow women women who are doing this in public, that's going to be against the law now. Mm-hmm. And so what happens? Okay, you've got a business. You're not allowed to be out in public because if you are, you'll be arrested as a prostitute. So what do? You hire someone who is allowed to be in public to go and do your marketing for you. So the woman couldn't be in public,
right,
advertising by her clothes and things like that as they used to do, right? But so what she does instead is she hires a man to go out for her and to procure. Because, that's what they used to call them, right? Procurers.
Right.
Okay? The idea of men dominating it took a little while. Some clever man managed to turn the relationship around pretty quickly.
Right.
Because they're unscrupulous. I'll report you if you don't give me a better, if you don't give me a higher cut, I'll report you because I'm not doing anything illegal. And so, of course, then they started coming up with pimping laws and so on and so forth. But
and there we are today, yeah.
The real idea of crime totally dominating it dates really to the 20s, and in the United States. And the reason for that is because, and this is something most people can't wrap their heads around, historically, prostitution, as I said, before the 19th century, it was not even the money was not even the thing.
Right, the harlotry thing, yeah.
Anytime there were laws, usually they were laws that were designed to do things like protect bloodlines and protect public order, or to protect the feelings of upper-class women. So, for example, the Romans, one of the laws, the Romans loved sumptuary laws. What sumptuary laws were is basically saying that if you were going to be a practicing sex worker, you had to wear yellow. You had to wear some yellow garment, a yellow scarf, a yellow shawl, a yellow whatever.
Yellow star?
Oh, no.
Well, that's what this sounds like. The
Well,
stigma,
the
right?
idea,
Scarlet letter, yeah.
Well, the idea was because courtesans made so much money, they could dress like upper class women, and the upper class women of the senatorial class, they certainly didn't want to be mistaken for courtesans.
Right.
They're a different kind of courtesan.
Right.
Get out of here.
For sale in a different way, right? Okay.
So they simply didn't wear yellow, and the courtesans had to wear yellow, and then everybody knew, and that was fine. But that's the kind of laws we saw in the past, okay? Sometimes they might restrict it to a certain area. Sometimes they might restrict it to certain hours. The Romans, it depended on how expensive your license was and things like that. How many hours you could work, and so on and so forth. But the idea of banning it completely, that's very, very recent. So in the 19th century, we're starting to see laws like you can't do it in public. The soliciting laws, right? You can't be seen to be doing it. Or the body house laws. You can't keep a place of prostitution. Okay? In New Orleans, my hometown, there was a very famous, even though it didn't last very long, for some reason it's become very well known. It's called the La Roquette Ordinance in the middle of the 19th century. It said you could not practice prostitution on the first floors of buildings.
And that meant why?
Oh, to keep it out of the sight of the good women.
Not in the lobby, but on the rooms you can.
Right,
see?
you could do it up. You could do it up on the second floor. It was okay. In fact, one of my favorite restaurants in New Orleans, Commander's Palace, had two separate entrances. They had the ground floor entrance for the families, and the second floor dining room, they had a separate entrance.
I heard about that on Anthony Bourdain's show. Yes.
Where where the fancy women could go with their clients.
I found that interesting, actually, having been to New Orleans and having been to Vegas. In Vegas, and it's different because like prostitution is actually legal in certain parts of Nevada, but you go to Vegas and you see those people flipping the little handout cards of women you can dial up and send to your room.
Yeah,
escorts.
And there's always a little warning that says, but prostitution's illegal.
That's your salesman there. Just people flipping cards. And
of course.
I wanted to laugh, by the way, this is completely off subject, but these people, they don't even speak English. Like, if you try to talk to them, they're just literally like migrant workers. A lot of them are undocumented,
They're hired.
It's money to do. But this one had it was called the Orgasm Doctor. Only they spelled orgasm wrong.
Oh, I saw that.
I am at
Orgasm Doctor.
Orgasm, yeah.
Well, but of course, because of these crazy laws, these guys would still be called pimps.
Right.
Could still be arrested.
Even though
and hit with a
they probably
felony.
know what they're doing
Yeah,
aside
the
from
minimum
what they're
wage.
handing out.
Yeah,
They
the
can
minimum
see a
wage.
picture,
They're not
that's
making
it.
minimum wage. No.
or
Right.
whatever.
They're probably making
You know,
less. Yeah.
I'm just using it as I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't mean literally minimum wage. I mean, I guess
Minimum
hard or
minimum
whatever.
wage, yeah.
or whatever.
What surprised me about New Orleans is you walked down Bourbon Street and there are literally like strippers right out front of the
Yeah.
place going,
Oh, yeah.
"Hey, come on in. This is what you'll see."
Oh, yeah.
I was like kind of surprised because I'd never been anywhere with that out in the open.
New
Used to
Orleans
that
is
in
different.
California.
Where here
New
it's like
Orleans
there's a sign and it's in pink lettering and it's blinking and it says "girls, girls, girls," but there's not a woman standing there.
No, New Orleans is different. It's
different,
more
yeah.
European. It's more European. But the thing, and New Orleans, of course, was the last. To get back to what I was saying about the ordinances and the laws, this was the norm throughout history. The idea of controlling it with these sorts of rules, and they'd come and they'd go. They'd come and they'd go. And so the idea of criminalization is so recent that most people just don't realize how recent it is, and it's so American that most people don't realize. I think the average person in the street, if you asked him, he would say that the rule is that prostitution is criminalized everywhere.
Right.
That is totally not true. The United States is the only major Western country where the act itself of selling sex is criminalized.
And even that we have in Nevada, so it's a state-by-state thing. It's just most states, right?
But most
so
states.
limited,
but
yeah.
but here's
I'm
the
trying to say
thing.
it's not federal, is all I'm trying to say.
In 1909, it was not illegal in any American state. It was illegal in some cities, but not any state. Okay? In 1914, it was illegal in all of them.
Oh, wow.
That was quick.
It was that fast. And
was
the reason
quick.
was because the last iteration of the sex trafficking hysteria. Just like we've seen with the sex trafficking hysteria, we've seen all these new laws, right? All these states making up laws against sex trafficking. Just like they did a few years ago with the sex offenders, right?
Yep.
In 1 year, nobody had a sex offender
You got
industry.
Jessica's Law,
5
Adam's
years
Law,
later,
here
boom.
Chelsea's Law. There's all these laws, yeah.
Right.
All
And
trying
it
to
was-
top one another.
Correct, and it was
Yeah.
the same thing from when the white slavery hysteria, as it was called then, but it's the same thing. Started in the aughts, and then in 1910, the federal government passed the Mann Act,
Right, the Mann Act, yeah.
and then by 1914, it was illegal in every single state, and even then, some of those states still maintained red light districts. New Orleans did, for example.
Of course.
So even though it was
How do you have New Orleans without a
Nullification, yeah.
Correct. So even though it was illegal everywhere else
Right.
in Louisiana, it was tolerated in a certain section of New Orleans, and that was until 1917 when the federal government, basically as part of the whole push for World War I,
Right.
basically clamped down and made it illegal pretty much everywhere. And the New Orleans government actually fought that tooth and nail because the revenues they were getting from Storyville were
I could
tremendous.
imagine. It made them the one stop, right?
yes.
Tremendous. You're taking away our revenue.
Tremendous.
Yeah.
The
The Mann Act was over state lines, right? You
The
couldn't
Mann
transport
Act
them.
said correct. You couldn't transport a woman over state lines for, quote, immoral purposes, close quote.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's something that, like, if you watch the show Boardwalk Empire, Nucky Thompson gets, like, charged with violating that.
It was very commonly used. It was one of those laws that was very, very, very commonly used against mobsters. It was also very commonly used against black men that had white girlfriends. So it was a very racist
Because,
law.
of course, that's an immoral.
Well, because
Yes,
they would
of
get at the
course it's
mobsters
immoral.
for. That's why it's used
You know.
in Boardwalk Empire. I was talking about because he would. If you were a mobster, you wanted to buy a politician, you'd bring in whores from all over the place.
Correct.
Even across state lines, you'd have a buddy that owns a brothel across state lines.
Correct.
And you'd entertain, with them,
Correct.
yeah,
And then you have
to get them on your side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
then you have dirt on them. So, a couple of kind of political science comments I wanted to make on this. First one is, and going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about criminalization and kind of when you push it into the shadows, that's where the criminals have to go, or not the criminals, that's where the customers have to go, and then that's where the sex workers have to go. But when I actually want to focus on the criminals, and I'm not saying every solicitor is a criminal, or I'm not calling prostitutes criminals, but there are, like we said, there are rapists and murderers and people who engage in assault and who are sadistic in this fashion, just like there are, anything else. What the point I'm trying to make, and this goes not just for prostitution, but for prohibition in general, is when you're just in a social psychology sense, when you're in a place where something that's generally illegal, and not just illegal, but it's considered culturally intolerable and immoral and dirty and something that's been pushed into the shadows, your mindset changes. And again, we talked about this on the show earlier, that everyone thinks that they're this hyper individual and they're not affected by society and the culture around them, but we are, and we're better off realizing that, and the rest are actually better at resisting it once we're aware of it than just thinking, it can happen to anyone, but it couldn't happen to me. It's ridiculous. We have this paradox in our schools where they're very bureaucratic and they're trying to teach that this is, they're trying to teach compliance, they're trying to teach the culture this is wrong. But you're an individual, you're special just like everybody else. It's like, give me a break. So when you have, I would say that you have people who are somewhere on the border, where you have men who maybe have urges to be violent against women. Or maybe they're just looking for an outlet for something like that. But even if they're not necessarily looking for an outlet, just when you bring something into the black market, the worst of people is going to come out. And then going to pimps. Again, they know they're procuring something illegal, something that's even considered immoral. So who is that job going to attract? It's going to attract men who are willing to coerce,
Correct.
who are willing to force, who are willing to take money from the basically people they have working contracts with, because you would imagine that most, let's say, I don't want to say honest citizens, but law-abiding citizens aren't going to go that route. Once you have that gray area, it's a huge problem. And you have the same problem with marijuana dispensaries. I mean, one of the complaints I hear all the time, because I know a lot of law enforcement and folks that are involved with marijuana dispensaries, so I know both sides of this, is young people, barely over 18, will get their medical marijuana cards, and they'll go into these dispensaries and they'll get their marijuana, and then they'll walk right outside, they're not super bright, and they'll start selling it just right outside the dispensary. And of course, where you have illegal drug sales, where you have drug trafficking, you're going to have shootings, you're going to have turf wars. This is the kind of stuff that happens because you're lacking the legal protection. So competition, this is what the form it takes, and you're attracting people that are willing to break the law. And then, it's the dispensary's fault. Well, no, you drove this into the dark, right? You drove this into the black market, and you're getting exactly the response that you should get when you drive into the black market. So every time I hear these arguments of all the bad things that happen, I think this is important. It's important to acknowledge, no, that does happen. Okay, not saying it happens as remotely as much as the government says, but it does. People do get shot over drugs and the drug trade. That is a problem that's related to it. Prostitutes do get raped and beat up, more so probably than the average woman. But it's important to acknowledge it's there. The reason for that is because of the way the legal framework is set up. We don't know how it would be if that weren't the case. We can't just generalize and assume, well, this is a bad thing, so we need to crack down even more. It's not working.
It's the confirmation bias that ends up creating the scenario in which that will the worst of things will happen anyway, and even maybe more so than if you just let it go and not
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly, right.
And in New Zealand, we've seen a drop in crimes that are around sex workers. And in fact, there was a wonderful case just in the past few months where a brothel owner, a brothel worker won a case against a brothel owner for sexual harassment.
Wow, okay.
Yes.
Something unheard of here. You would think about, wow, really?
Unheard of here, but imagine that. Yeah. But what she did was, he was trying to force employees to have sex with him, not paying them, just to give him free. This will be the equivalent, and this is basically the court reasoning, this will be the equivalent of a restaurant owner forcing the chef to come to his house and cook his dinner and not pay him for it.
Right.
Right?
Which you can't do.
You can't do that.
Well, you could put that in the contract, maybe, but you can't just force them to do it.
And I don't think they're allowed to put it in the contract.
Paid.
But the thing is,
on the clock.
But they'd be paid, right?
Yeah, she sued and she won. So here, that would be considered a crime. It would all be considered crimes. There's no protection.
Like a legal victory to me there.
It's a big legal victory, and this shows how decriminalization works. You treat everybody like normal adults, And presto, they act like normal adults.
Imagine that, right? Wow.
And kind of the other place I wanted to go with that, also political commentary, and I'm glad you brought up mobsters in the 1920s. And of course, in the 1920s, what was going on in the U.S.?
Prohibition.
Prohibition.
Yeah.
So
why were they mobsters? Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Well,
yeah.
Actually, this is a very inconvenient theory for a lot of proponents of the police state and neocons. In general, I love to break neocon hearts. It's one of the things I do on the show. Is that the rise, kind of prohibition, and obviously when you're bringing up about sex workers in the 19-teens, same idea, same problem. That it kind of gave rise to organized crime in this country. We didn't really have gangs. We didn't really. I mean, we had
there was Italian stuff, but it was very in their own communities.
They're in their own enclaves, like in New York.
It was more like the traditional back.
Well, no, you had like bandits. You had outlaws, like out in the Wild West. Mm-hmm. And by this point, the frontier was gone, and it was really kind of winding down. And now you gave these guys something they could sell, and it wasn't just alcohol. Mm-hmm. So this, in turn, gives rise to the police state, because now, in voters' minds, there is a market, there's a demand for federal law enforcement. We didn't even really have federal law enforcement in its modern form until the 1920s. We have the rise of the FBI with J. Edgar Hoover.
And they chronicle that in Boardwalk Empire, same show.
And I want to point out, by the way, the Bureau of Investigation, which was the predecessor to the FBI, guess what its number one mission was
Prostitution.
In the teens, and the number one, teens and 20s, but prior to Prohibition. And the number one source of its growth was Mann Act, was investigating Mann Act violations. That was its big thing. So it's the whole white slavery investigations had a lot to do with it. And Thad Russell, the historian, wrote an article for Reason just a few months ago about that, about how the prohibition of prostitution basically fueled the rise of the FBI.
Right.
Absolutely.
And the surveillance state.
Hey, but if you make a comparison with modern history, like with the 1970s, 1980s, borders, and again, this border patrol, closed borders in general, and drug trafficking and drug prohibition really go hand in hand. Because if you look at the budgets of agencies like Customs or Border Patrol, and there was no DHS
or ICE,
yet.
No.
Right, well, no, but see the thing, that didn't even exist.
No.
Back
ICE is
in
pretty
1970s, 1980s, because there was no demand for it. It's like, yeah, people do drugs. People cross the border. This is normal. And once you criminalize this stuff, you create a demand for billions and billions of dollars, literally flushed down this toilet. It accomplishes nothing. Yeah. You're building walls. And now, 40 years later, we don't just have these agencies. Now we have the DHS. They now have their own department. Think about that.
Cabinet level.
That's devoted to this. That's basically devoted to enforcing these laws, none of which we need. And that goes for border laws, too. And if you think about it, you make that connection. Naturally, the FBI hates them because they're competitors. It's a different department. It's DOJ. And now everything they're doing, now the FBI is not getting funding for what it wants to do. So you really have to think of it from that perspective. And then, of course, we've talked multiple times on this show about the prison industrial complex, which goes right along with that. So if you look at it from the money factor, okay, these agencies, they have unions, they have lobbies, and they lobby for this stuff. They lobby for these laws because that's their job security.
They want their seat at the table.
Their budgets. Now, the difference between, even when you talk about corporations lobbying for profit, I'm not for that. I'm not for corporate subsidies. But those corporations are at least producing something useful. This is producing nothing.
You want to
nothing.
see...
It's a complete waste of resources.
We should probably wrap up soon, but you want to see, by the way, the logical continuance of what some of these crazy border people are? I was just watching this story about Afghani heroin production and how these border towns in Afghanistan are wastelands of addiction and violence because what are they trying to do? They're trying to smuggle it into Iran and thus the rest of Europe from there. And you want to see the difference between how we do drug enforcement at the border and how they do it? Theirs is an actual platoon down there. Like when they say, here, we want the military on the border, Iran just did it. And they're using bazookas, rocket launchers. There's trenches with barbed wire and tanks, shit. Does it stop the heroin? No, that's Europe. That's where the heroin comes from.
Well, look at California. We mentioned this on the show before. We had where they had the border walls, and they discovered the tunnel. And this wasn't even they find tunnels all the time, but now they actually found one that had rails, like a railroad, going through it. and they're pushing
Yeah,
like
we're hearing
little
about that.
rail carts, and this is like a 40
And they don't just
mile,
bring drugs; they
no.
bring people
Right.
supposedly.
Okay,
But,
so no,
you know.
I'm sure they do. But
Yeah.
look, okay, you're talking about the drug cartels. You're talking about organized crime now that can afford its own subway system.
So they
And you're
have the
gonna-
thing; they're going to use it for other things, right?
Right.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
well, it's not even that. These cartels are dangerous. I don't care
like
about
Sinaloa, yeah, probably the most barbaric.
Right.
people
They
you could
cut
deal with.
people's heads off. I don't
Right.
care that they're
On
smuggling
video.
drugs. It's what they do for competition purposes. So if you're enabling drug cartels to be able to build their own subway system, think about that. Why? Because we're pouring so many resources into trying to enforce against them that what we do with it, incidentally, is we increase what they get paid. We increase demand, and we raise up the prices for what they're selling because it's more expensive
worth it, yeah.
for them to fight the system. But not so expensive that we can actually break demand because, like I said, people are going to use drugs. People are going to fuck. It's not going anywhere. So what you're creating with these laws, is you're creating a public serfdom, either the drug cartel or to the law enforcement agencies. And neither is producing anything, really. I mean, okay, you could say the drugs are production, but again, that's not a staple crop. That's not food. That's not them producing anything that's necessarily useful to society. So, I'm sorry I'm kind of ranting here, but, I mean, the movie Traffic makes a great kind of point about this, that the law enforcement folks, based on who they target, they're actually working inadvertently for the opposing drug cartel.
for one
Yes.
cartel or another.
Because when
yeah.
you bust the head of one cartel, you just took out
Empower
the
the other.
competition for another drug cartel.
yeah.
And it's interesting you talk about this because, of course, it could be pointed out that if that even though sex trafficking does not now exist in the form that that it is that the myth says it exists. In other words, yes, people are coerced, but it's generally a one-on-one type of thing. And like I said earlier, it's hard to even tell apart from domestic violence. Or it's merely a consensual arrangement, smuggling people across the border that both sides agree to, that
Usually
tends
is,
to
yeah.
be somewhat unfair to the person, the smugglee, simply because because there's no better business bureau for smuggling people across
Happens
the
with
border.
Chinese people all the time. They get here and then now they're working as slaves for the person who
Correct,
got them.
correct.
Right,
So
yeah.
there's those things, but that's not the same as these international cartels that were being, claimed that the trafficking people like to claim exist. However, I might point out that if the whole human trafficking thing does not collapse in the next few years, and I predict it will, but if it didn't, let's just say, theoretically, it went the same way the drug war went. Billions and billions and billions and billions being dumped into trying to suppress commercial sex. The effect that would have will be to create these mythical cartels that do exist in drugs right now. These things would exist because
Right.
if guys can't find regular, plain old escorts advertising, if we've wiped out regular escort advertising, if the police are coming down so hard on escorts driving themselves around and doing all the normal things that sex workers do, if this were all somehow suppressed to drug war levels, which we're definitely not at yet, but let's just say if we did, it would only, the effect would be to create these mythical trafficking
very thing
cartels.
that they-
the very
right,
thing
yeah,
that they were
yeah.
supposedly guarding
Trying to tamp
against.
down on, yeah.
You know,
It's a losing game. It is.
very much so.
And I guess my kind of closing question to you, Maggie, and this is a question I want to ask you, but I want to save it for the end.
Go ahead.
What is your recommendation? I understand decriminalization, but I feel like decriminalization is more of a, I don't want to say ideological proposal, but it's more of a policy direction proposal. I'm a policy person. I'm an organizer. I have political science. So specifically, when I say, as opposed to just decriminalization is what you would propose to the politicians. And it's a reasonable proposal. Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. But the politicians clearly aren't listening. Not if you look at the walls 50 miles south of here. They're not. And they're not listening because I don't have the money that the DHS unions have, and neither do you. This is just,
It's shouting into the wind.
It
so
really,
to speak, yeah.
it really is, and of course, the money that's going, where are they getting their money from? Their budget. It's a nice revolving door. So what would you recommend for people that want to be activists, that want to organize against this, that want to stop this, and whether it's stopping the criminalization of prostitution or the drugs, any kind of vice, anything that basically is kind of, we've created a culture of it being
taboo,
immoral and taboo, and the laws against it are hurting people, not just the people involved in it, but really, robbing us of resources, creating these cartels, which are dangerous, and creating just basically hazardous working conditions and enabling these bureaucracies and just law enforcement abuse. What would you recommend for people to do that oppose this, as opposed to politicians and policy?
Hearts and minds.
Educating people.
Educating people is what I'm doing. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm going around, winning hearts and minds, because I think when you look at the parallel with gay rights, the gay rights movement and the sex worker rights movement in the United States are about the same age, roughly, late 60s. Okay? So why has gay rights progressed so much beyond sex worker rights? Well, I think the reason is because gay people have been out. Gay people started coming out. They started letting people know, see, we're just normal, we're just like everybody else. People weren't scared of them anymore. And when that happened, things started to change. And so I think sex workers, not all sex workers can be out. That's true. I'm not even out in my own hometown because it's just too small. But I'm out in public like I am now, talking to you guys, go and make public appearances. And these things, I think, make a big, big difference. I think people know and people understand. They get to know you as a human being. They get to know you as a person, and that makes all the difference in the world. But so yes, that's what that's what I think. And from in the big picture, I think what's going to happen in the United States, and some people disagree with me on this, but I really feel that what's going to turn the tide for the rights in the United States is going to be basically the same sort of thing as Roe versus Wade, Lawrence versus Texas. If you look at, in the United States, sexual issues are never, never, never granted through legislatures. They're always done through courts. Lawrence versus Texas, Roe versus Wade, etc. And I think that's going to be the way it's going to be with this too.
Okay, quick follow-up on that. And I see what you're saying. I think you're right that legislation tends to be more restrictive and more abusive and more detached from reality. And then when it bounces back to the judiciary, it's like, get out of here.
Right.
Who wrote this? A 5-year-old with a creek? Get. Yeah. And that's it. It's that simple. And I'm with you. I'm hopeful that is how the Supreme Court and just courts in general, state Supreme Courts, are going to see not just prostitution laws, but a lot of the Patriot Act and a lot of the restrictive laws we've seen pass. And people tell me that, we've never had this in prison. Actually, we have. Have you heard of the Red Scare in the 50s? Joseph McCarthy. This is not...
In the 20s.
Oh, yes.
Another one in the 20s.
There's two. I was going to say, which one did you mean? Yeah.
And even during the Civil War, stuff like this was going on.
And the late 19th century, the Yellow Peril.
Oh, yes.
There was
and
a Chinese
further back, then
Act
there was the witch thing.
So there's multiple. Yeah, there's all this. This
always
happens,
another class.
And it does not last. Eventually, there comes kind of a period of cleansing where it's all thrown out, and it's just it obviously goes through cycles. So I agree with you on that. Now, one thing I do have to kind of add is that I feel like what I do, and this is, I've been told it's a dangerous game, but my retort is always it's a more dangerous game not to play this game, is I always teach people to resist unconstitutional law enforcement. And like you were talking about, a lot of the things you were saying earlier in the show, Maggie, in the beginning of the show, about the way police treat sex workers and the arrests and this isn't criminal. Okay, a lot of that, and I can't get into specifics necessarily because we've talked about a lot of things, a lot of that relies on compliance. Sure,
absolutely.
If one sex worker or one person that solicits a sex worker refuses to do what the police tell them to do, they're opening themselves up to more abuse. But if this becomes a trend, if we turn into a culture, and I think we're getting there with a lot of abusive laws, if a police officer approaches you and says, show me your ID, and I say, I don't have to show you my ID. What is your warrant or cause for accosting me and asking me for my ID? In fact, am I under arrest? No? Am I free to go? The thing is, and this has kind of always been my kind of my method of fighting government, and I've won a lot of battles against it this way. They have limited resources as well. And when you do this, you stretch them. And you raise their costs of abusing you. Sure, that cop could pull out his pepper spray and he could pull out his nightstick and he could beat you up and hurt you and whatever. He's most likely not going to do that. He's probably going to go search for easier meat. That's been my experience. I mean, you could say I have the privilege of being a middle-class white male, and people who are minorities, women, maybe stand a little more risk with doing something like that. On the other hand, they're also more likely to be abused, so they have more gain. They have more to gain by resisting this way. But all you're doing is you're basically forcing them to make a case that they can do to you what they're doing to you. Because when you comply with it, they essentially rely on compliance. All government abuse relies on compliance. So if you have a culture, if you have even 10, 15% of Americans taking this stance, no, whatever you're going to do to me, you're going to make a case for why you're doing it to me. And of course, the key to this is staying calm. It's not threatening them back. It's not getting aggressive. It's just, nope, I don't have to do what you tell me until you show me what law and what makes this constitutional and what makes this legal. In my opinion, that, just 1 week of 15% of Americans doing that, the entire police state would collapse. Because they simply don't have the resources. And everyone will see through, hey, this isn't working, we're still safe. The world hasn't ended. It's just these douchebag cops thinking they own the world now.
It's funny how flustered they get when someone knows what their rights are.
Oh, yes.
How much it knocks them off their game. They're like, wait a minute, you're usually just supposed to just do what I say. Why aren't you doing that? And they don't know where to go from there. It's funny to see.
4 out of 5 times, in my personal experience, their response is to back off. They're like, oh, crap.
Because they know they're in over their head at that point.
Because they think, okay, I could forcibly subdue this person. Of course, I've got a gun, I've got a nightstick. Of course you could forcibly. What I'm doing is I'm forcing you to use force because you don't have anything else.
That's all you have. Yeah,
and then the risk is, okay, but he seems to know his rights. So when he gets out of the hospital, he's going to do this thing called hire a lawyer, and then the media, and then my batchman's like, oh, shit.
I can't remember who said it, but there's a quote, violence is the last resource of the incompetent.
Absolutely.
That's a good quote.
Yes, what I'm suggesting is that we make it their only resource, and let's see how long that lasts.
I think that's a good note to wrap up on. I want to thank our guest, Maggie McNeill, and by all means, check out her blog, which is your name, I believe, and I can let you tell me that.
It's Maggie McNeill, .wordpress.com, MAGGIEMCNEILL.wordpress.com. And also, I'd like to mention that I do have a book out, Ladies of the Night. It is short stories. It's not political. It's not erotica. It's just stories. Science fiction, some of them, horror, fantasy, crime, a couple of romance in there even, drama, all sorts of things. And the only thing that ties them together is that all of them have, as a character, as a main character, a sex worker. Sometimes the protagonist, sometimes the antagonist. But I think you'll like it. I think you'll enjoy it. You can get it from Amazon. You can even order it from Barnes & Noble, actually, or you can get it on my website.
I was reading many really good reviews about it. Lots of people are like, wow, she's just an amazing stostoryteller.
Thank you.
Very vivid. So I do want to read it, actually, once I have to get on Kindle and get it.
I've got some in the car if you want.
Really? No.
Yes.
Just might take you up on that.
I feel like my impression with what you're doing, one of the things you want to do with this book politically, is you're wanting to present sex workers in a variety of roles.
Yes, exactly.
So real world type of
just like
exactly.
people. It's
Just
a regular
like people.
person that happens to have this as a profession for
Correct.
whatever reason.
Correct. And sometimes, in some of the stories, it's pivotal to the story. In some of the stories, it's barely even noticeable. And that's the thing, is that I just kind of want people to start thinking of sex workers and just as people. Like, that's just her job. Just like she could be a teacher in the story. Just like she could be a secretary. Just like she could be a doctor. It's just not... it's not a story of degradation and doom and gloom and the usual sorts of things you see with sex workers.
Right.
I think smashing the taboo is very important.
Yes.
One thing I really liked when I was reading your blog, one of the first things you say is if you want to know what a sex worker looks like, well, look around you.
Look around,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Regular women. And
It's kind of like saying what's a gay person look like?
Right.
Anyone.
It's exactly
anyone. They
where
can look at
exactly.
anyone.
Right. Exactly where I was going to go with this is that I think that a lot of the taboos around homosexuality really kind of, it's this Rick Santorum mindset where the homophobes think about gay sex more than gay,
More than
men,
gay
do.
men do, yes.
It's like,
Right.
But that's what it comes down to, is when we make homosexuals into a class. When you think of a homosexual in the political sense, you're thinking about their sex life. Firstly, I really don't care where anyone. I don't know why. As a
Why do
straight
you
man,
want to know
I really
that?
don't. Those are images. I'm better off without anything to do with that. But other than that, it's a regular person, right? They get up in the morning, they go take a shower, they have breakfast, they have a job. And the same thing,
with sex workers.
With sex workers.
Absolutely.
So I like this idea. I think it's great. I just think that there's multiple directions at which we have to come at this. It's good, you have the culture change, but you also kind of have to resist the oppression. And I think homosexuals have done a great deal of that.
They have done a great job, and I wish that the sex worker rights movement would kind of get its stuff together and do the same thing.
And that's actually one of I'm sorry, we're kind of going over, but it's okay. Real quick, other question for you. Are you aware of any organizations that are advocates or effective organizers for sex workers in this sense?
There's plenty of organizations, actually. There are more in other countries in the United States. In Australia, the peak body is Scarlet Alliance, and it has a bunch of other groups under it, and they are extremely effective. But some of the best work being done, and my heroines are the Indian and Thai and Cambodian sex worker groups. They are just phenomenal. The Indian groups even operate their own schools. They have their own juvenile sports teams. They have their own bank.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they've just really created this parallel system because since the culture at large wants to exclude them, okay, we'll create our own.
We'll make our own thing, yeah.
But the advantage they have, you see, is that in India, it's that old British thing. Sex work itself is not illegal. In the United States, it's very hard to do that. In the United States, it's extremely hard. So we have some groups here. We have the Sex Workers Outreach Project. It's probably the most famous one. We have there's a sex worker project at the Urban Justice Center in New York. There's a few smaller ones, different groups here in California. There are probably more than in other places. There's the St. James Infirmary, which provides free medical care to sex workers. That's in the Bay Area. So there are different things. We're hoping. Oh, there's one called the Erotic Service Providers. SPLRP is the acronym. I can't think of the exact what it means. Yeah, but they're trying to foot a legal challenge. So if you want to support the sex worker rights movement, that's certainly something you could do. You could donate to SWAP. You could donate to to St. James Infirmary. You could donate to SPLRP. You could go to my blog and donate to me. I wouldn't mind. You could even buy my book, and I'll mention that for the second time. But because that all helps, it supports the work.
And I thank you for that, Maggie. It also sounds to me like there's really a need for more of these organizations.
I think
it sounds
so too.
like in countries where they're stronger, they're better organized, they're better funded, and of course those countries are different. They're doing a lot more good, and they're way ahead of the United States for that reason. So really, it's fine to donate, and it's great to get involved, but I think really we need more of these. And of course, homosexuals have their lobbies, and there's a tremendous amount of organizing that's been done. And some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. I mean, there's things where I feel GLAAD has overstepped, and its bounds, and even though they've done a great job for homosexuals, some of the constitutionality issues around things they've done. But they have, as far as homosexual rights go, they've done a great job. So I feel like we have the precedent set. We have the practice that this works and the evidence base, and we really need a lot more of sex workers coming out, like you said, and joining these organizations and organizing. 150 years ago, you could have said the same thing about industrial workers and their unions.
Correct.
And the way they were being abused. And
and they did.
That came together, and they organized, and they were able to stand up to the oppression. And, again, I feel like they overstepped their bounds in some senses, but as far as their own rights go, they were able to represent themselves.
And I look forward to the day when my granddaughter can be sitting on a show with your grandson and arguing the opposite, that your grandson will be arguing that the sex workers' rights movement has overstepped its bounds. And that would be great. And I'm looking forward to that day.
That's a good thing to look forward to.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Definitely thank you for being with us.
I was happy to be here, guys.
Thank you for listening to Edge of Chaos.
All right.
I'm Neurotoxin.
I'm Joe Ryan, here with Maggie McNeill.
Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show at edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at edgeofchaosshow. We can be found on Facebook at facebook.com/The Edge of Chaos. Neurotoxins blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, fyg.blogspot.com. My blog can be found at joeryansworld.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.